From the Pasadena Media Center, this is Arroyo Live. Hello, I'm Joe Carbonetta. This program is produced by Pasadena Media to help enrich the community through informative and meaningful conversation. As always, you can share your comments with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. There is little argument that homelessness has become an epidemic in the U.S. In fact, the most recent statistics show that every night across the country, more than 300,000 men, women, and children stay in a homeless shelter. An additional 200,000 spend each night on the streets. Just as troubling, it is estimated that as much as 30% of the 500,000 homeless in the U.S. are families with children. And the statistics only get worse. A recent survey suggests that in some urban areas, death rates among the homeless has increased a horrifying 77% between 2016 and 2020. The lack of affordable housing and accessible medical and psychological care are certainly among the reasons for the explosion in our nation's homelessness. But there are other causes as well, including the COVID pandemic and subsequent economic downturn. Trying to keep up with the ever increasing number of those experiencing homelessness is challenging, requiring a massive effort. During the last 10 days in January, dedicated staff and volunteers across the nation fan out in what is officially called the point in time count, otherwise known as the homeless count. Tonight, a conversation with a few of those who work so hard to bring attention to this growing issue. Please join me for this edition of Arroyo Live. Joining me now are Jennifer O'Reilly Jones, City of Pasadena Homeless Programs Coordinator, Patrick Perry from Showers of Hope, and Terry Bourne, a homeless count volunteer. I'd like to begin by asking each of you to talk a little bit about your respective positions and tell us a little bit about yourselves. Uh, the way Zoom works, for anybody who's used it, you get a random uh, list of the participants in the meeting. They're in no particular order. Patrick, you happen to be at the top of that list this evening, so I'd like to begin with you.
I'm with Knox Presbyterian Church. I work with their housing and homeless services group. We do host a shower of hope at the Knox Church every Wednesday. And as part of the homeless count, we did have a team from the church that went out and surveyed one of the districts. But we also surveyed the people who come to the Shower of Hope. Shower of Hope is a nonprofit organization that provides mobile showers and other services, some clothing, hygiene items, and so forth to unhoused individuals. Like I said, they operate every Wednesday at the Knox campus, and we've been working with them for about 3 years in that regard.
All right. Well, Patrick, apologies for the misidentification there, but thank you for joining us. I will move on to Miss Jennifer O'Reilly Jones. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm with the City of Pasadena. I work in the housing department. And as Joe said, I'm the city's homeless programs coordinator. What my job entails is overseeing and administering our Pasadena continuum of care for homeless services. Pasadena is designated by HUD as one of these continuums of care, which is essentially a jurisdiction for homeless services. So as a continuum of care, we call them COCs. We're required to do a homeless count. So that is one of my main duties, is making sure we fulfill our COC requirement and have a homeless count every year.
All right. Well, thank you for being here with us this evening as well. And Mr. Terry Bourne, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as well, please?
Yes, yeah. My name is Terry Bourne. I'm retired. I'm also a intern here at Pasadena Media. I've been a volunteer for quite a bit of things. So, like from youth sports, Boy Scouts, church. It's pretty much just a small part. So, just glad to be a part. First time. I've done a lot of recording and stuff, but I've never had a chance to actually see myself uh, being part of it. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening also. Yeah, I can certainly understand, it's definitely a new experience the first time you're sitting in front of a camera. And I can tell you that, even as time goes by, it doesn't get old. Uh, anyway, so moving on to the topic of our discussion this evening, which is the 2023 homeless count. I was reading some statistics, and by most estimates, there are more than 500,000 people homeless across the country on any given night. Uh, Statistically, we're seeing about 300,000 of those that are in homeless shelters, but an estimated 200,000 are on the street every night. And additionally, approximately 30% of those 500,000 homeless are estimated to be families with children. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the homeless situation. How bad is it? Are these numbers that we're seeing, are those considered fairly accurate?
Yes, they are accurate. I think it's important to highlight that those numbers represent um, our homeless population on any given night. So it's a snapshot in time. Those statistics are pulled from homeless counts all across the country. So if you were to, pull any day out of the calendar, that particularly one in the winter, that's likely what we would see. There are certainly other metrics and ways of enumerating our homeless population. One of those, of course, is looking at an annual number of people who experience homelessness. So that number tends to be much higher. So, the total number of folks who experience homelessness over the course of a whole year. But we use the homeless count data to track trends over time to analyze the demographics of our homeless population. And that's how it's a really valuable tool.
Well, the first question that comes to mind, as you mentioned, we're talking about the 500,000 estimate is a snapshot in time. That's on any given night. But if you are looking at the statistics across an entire year, the number is even greater. Are we seeing these numbers trending upward or downward?
So nationwide, we are seeing an upward trend for sure, and actually across the state. Last year, across our county, we saw what hopefully was the beginning of sort of a leveling off. The past few years in Pasadena, we've seen our numbers kind of plateau. We don't have the numbers from 2023 yet, but we're hoping that continues to be the trend, and that we'll actually start to see a downward movement in our homeless numbers. Of course, it's still early to see really the full effects of the pandemic. I think that we'll see more of those effects in our results from 2023 than we did in 2022. And part of that leveling off was also likely tied to the expanded tenant protections that occurred during the pandemic. So we're certainly in an era of unprecedented crisis around homelessness, but also unprecedented resources. And so I'm ever the optimist, and I do see a lot of opportunity for change, and I really believe that it's doable and that we can turn it around.
Well, I want to seize on something you just said there, because you did use the word unprecedented, and from that I would infer that we have never seen homelessness in this country on the level that we're currently experiencing it. Is that fair to say?
I believe it to be accurate. Yes. Yeah. This is a crisis that we, society, created. Homelessness, really, the way that it looks today, started coming around in the 80s, as we, as a nation, um, disinvested in affordable housing. And I think, crisis after crisis has compounded that. So the Great Recession also had major effects on the homeless population that we're seeing today. That's really when we saw numbers start to skyrocket was a few years after that. So many additional households were losing their homes.
And when you say the Great Recession, we're talking circa 2007, 2008. Is that correct?
That's right, yes. And and the effect on our homeless numbers was a few years delayed, um, but certainly tied to that recession.
Well, and certainly to say the Great Recession and other factors like that paints with a pretty broad brush. Are there more direct factors that we can point to that are among the chief causes for the explosion in the homeless population that we're currently seeing?
Absolutely. Homelessness is really a symptom of many systems failing. But I think first and foremost, it's important to remember that ultimately this is a housing crisis, and that in California we're 30 years behind in developing and building housing, particularly affordable housing. Um, you know, the, there are certainly mental illness and substance use and poverty, systemic racism. There's so many factors that lead an individual to homelessness, but systemically, um, the housing crisis is at the root of it, and all those other factors exacerbate it. But the lack of available affordable housing is really what's driving the homelessness crisis.
Well, and you were quick to point out, however, that it's in California that we're 30 years behind. So while the housing crisis itself it may be playing a very large part in the homeless situation in the state of California, what about across the country?
When you look at areas that are also experiencing crises like we are in California, in New York, for instance, other metropolises, the ones that have had the biggest growth in homelessness over the last decade really are the ones that have the largest shortages in affordable housing. There is data that really demonstrates that the housing inventory is tied to the homeless population, the homeless crisis.
I think that's perhaps an important point to underscore is that, as you mentioned, wherever we're seeing the highest percentage of homeless in any given state, it generally correlates to a lack of affordable housing.
That's right.
Well, let's move on to what's most commonly known as the homeless count, but in fact is officially called a point in time. That's correct.
That's correct. The point in time homeless count. So behind the scenes, we refer to it as the pit, the point in time. Um, and yeah, that's HUD's moniker for it.
And this is a nationwide process, so it's a massive undertaking. Is that correct?
That's correct. So as I mentioned at the beginning, each continuum of care across the country is required to conduct a homeless count. We count both the folks who are living outside and in RVs and cars, and also those who are sheltered on the night of the homeless count. Um, HUD requires continuum of, continuums of care to do this actually every 2 years for the full combined count of sheltered and unsheltered. But most jurisdictions, especially here in California, elect to do it every year, so that we have, that data year after year.
And the count takes place during the last 10 days of January. I was wondering why January, and specifically the end of January, was selected as the time that the count would be conducted each year.
That's right. We're required to conduct the count during that short window. The reason for that, and we often get this question, is because folks are more likely to be in shelters at that time. And so, as a data collection exercise, it's easier and more reliable to capture the data from folks who are in shelters rather than finding them on the street. I think in other parts of the country, that effect is likely more pronounced, where it's colder in the winter. Um, but here in Pasadena, we have weather activated shelters. Most recently, it's been in in motels with motel vouchers. And we do make sure to have the seasonal shelters open on the night of account each year so that we can have that consistency in the data.
My sense is that while, of course, we hear about the 10-day window and we see the news reports annually these days because this is a much larger or higher profile event now that the homeless population has increased so significantly. We hear about the count being conducted in the 10-day window, and then, of course, it all disappears from the news cycles. But my sense is that there's more to it than just the 10 days of collecting the data. That data then has to be parsed and processed. And I'm wondering if you could take a little time to tell us about the point in time count and how that takes place probably over the course of the entire year.
That's absolutely right. It's really a year-round exercise for us. We start planning and coordinating. Um, we actually start planning the day after the homeless count for the next year. We don't miss a beat, and we always kind of chuckle at ourselves when we have that first meeting and we're just ready to start the new round. But we start most of our planning and organizing in the early fall, and that's when we start to do things like look if we need to, revise our maps. We have our volunteers assigned to different zones. We start talking about, do we want to update the survey that we administer? Are we going to make changes to how we recruit and organize our volunteers, et cetera? So all through the fall, we're doing that type of work and recruiting volunteers, training volunteers. The count takes place in January, like you said. And then from February and March, we spend really analyzing the data, cleaning the data, which means making sure we're, removing any data that, maybe if someone was counted outside of the city boundary, for instance, or if we find there was a duplicate count. And then we do put together a report that we present to our city council and a lot of community groups, usually in May or June. So that whole process is almost the whole year. But the other part of it is that, this is a data collection exercise, and we use the homeless count data the whole year to help with our strategic planning, to help inform what types of projects we're going to fund, to tell us how we're doing, where things may need to be changed. And we also use the data for equity analyses that we do over the course of the year. So we use the demographic data from the homeless count as sort of a baseline against which we compare, the enrollment and outcome data for the homeless services that are offered here in Pasadena.
Well, I couldn't help but note that you mentioned you really start planning for the next homeless count basically the day after the current count ends. And I was struck by how much that sounds like the planning that goes into the Rose Parade. So it's just as massive an undertaking as putting on the annual parade. It seems that there are an awful lot of things that go on within the city that require a whole year's worth of work, and so basically this is the Rose Parade without the gentlemen in white coats running around, and
Yeah, no horses either, but
is good and perhaps more important. Um, my next question becomes beyond simply generating the report. What happens? What comes of all the information you gather from conducting this count every year?
so I mentioned a few, but I can give you some more examples. One example I love, this was actually from last year's count in 2022. As we were in the early stages of doing our data analysis, one thing that we noticed right away was we had asked individuals during the unsheltered homeless count, we'd asked them about their vaccination status for COVID-19. And so we had that information as part of our early results. And we recognized that our homeless population, their vaccination rates were starting to lag behind the general population, which we hadn't seen up until then. So even before our report was published and we were public with the results, we met with our public health department and planned and coordinated some vaccine clinics that were specifically for folks experiencing homelessness, and we did another round of having our outreach team provide vaccines on the street. So that's one example of how, here in Pasadena, because we're a relatively small community, we have the ability to, conduct this survey with the folks that we encounter and ask really specific questions that can inform the work that we're doing, so we can get to know our homeless neighbors really well. We also use the data to inform the types of programs that we're going to fund and the types of funding we're going to go after. Last year, another thing that we saw and was seen actually across the county was an increase in our Hispanic or Latino homeless population. And here in Pasadena, we saw that particularly among homeless families. The size or the proportion of our Hispanic Latino homeless population had been kind of creeping up slowly over the past few years, but we did see a big jump last year. And we think that's likely a result of the pandemic and the economic effects of the pandemic, particularly on that community. So knowing that we were seeing a rise in homelessness among Hispanic and Latino families, we applied for a grant from the state, the Family Homelessness Challenge Grant, and were awarded that funding. And we've partnered with a local agency, Door of Hope, to administer homelessness prevention programming, financial supports, case management, particularly for families. And Door of Hope, in turn, has partnered with our local school district, which does serve predominantly Hispanic and Latino children, for referrals. So it's, our hope, of course, is to get out ahead of it, to serve more families and prevent them from falling into homelessness, and hopefully, reverse that trend, and so that we're not seeing an overrepresentation of Hispanic and Latino families among our homeless population.
When it comes to the count, there simply could not possibly be enough staff to cover it, and so you rely heavily on volunteers to conduct that count, and that's again across the nation. That's correct?
Yes, that's correct. So this year we had over 170 volunteers. We're so fortunate in Pasadena. We have such an active, involved, compassionate community. So we actually usually have to kind of turn off and put a deadline on our volunteer signups so that we don't get too many volunteers. That's actually happened before. And so we had about 170 volunteers, including community volunteers, folks like Patrick here. And then we also have what we call professional volunteers, which means professional homeless service workers, usually street outreach workers. And they are grouped into different teams and sent into different zones around the city. We do cover 100% of the city's geography, including down in the Arroyo, up in the natural areas, the parks, the light rail platforms, etc. So it's quite an undertaking, and we take it really seriously. And that's how we know and how we can feel confident in our data. We recognize the limitations of the homeless count data, that it is just a snapshot, but we know that we've covered every inch of the city. We do it over the course of a day, from one evening to the next evening, and we can feel confident that we have an accurate representation of our homeless population.
Explain to our viewers at home how they can become volunteers in future counts if they are interested in participating.
Absolutely. We have new volunteers every year, and we make sure to do a lot of training, provide a lot of resources so everyone's comfortable and knows what they're doing. We open up volunteer signups in the late fall. It's often around Thanksgiving. And you can go to PasadenaHomelessCount.org and you'll find a sign up link there, or PasadenaPartnership.org. And a sign up link will be there. So if you keep your eye on those websites, it'll open up around late November, early December.
Right. Patrick and Terry, you both have been involved in the homeless count process this year, and I know at least for Terry, you've been involved in previous years as well. And I would like to get you involved in the conversation as well. I'd like to hear about your experiences actually conducting the count. Terry, can I go to you first?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I came out of District 3 with our team leader was Noreen Sullivan, who was a liaison with, I think, District 4, if that's correct. Um, and the other part of our team, uh, this is my second year that I participated. We had a gentleman named Mark that came out of, who actually was he counted back in San Bernardino some years ago. So he had a little experience. And the newcomer we had with us, because Marina and I worked together last year, was Maria. And she was like a volunteer. And apparently she does a lot of volunteer to the program. Last year we went out, we only had like six to nine people that we counted. And this year, with Mark being a part of it, so we had three of us that had some experience. And it made it a lot easier for us. And we broke down into two. Luckily, we had a male and a female. We worked in teams in that manner. And we walked the streets a little bit more than we did last year. Mark made some very valid points. We went in to McDonald. I worked off a lake. Our area consisted of lake to Villa across to Fair Oaks back north of Mountain. So we had a pretty good sized area that we covered. And Mark actually went into the back parking lot. We didn't go into the back parking lot. No. They were well lit, McDonald's and Starbucks on Lake Avenue. But as a count, did a pretty good job. I've learned a few more things that I didn't know. There are people that I didn't see on the street, that I see on the streets on a normal basis. I thought that he's still on the street over the years. And there was a place by the church over here off the lake. Apparently, they wait until I guess the gym is closed and they let them house them in there. I don't. We did the count on them, but after that was done, they went into I guess the church for their overnight house.
Patrick, I would like to again ask the same of you, your experience, conducting the homeless count and being involved in the program.
Sure. Like I mentioned, the church, Knox Presbyterian, organized a team. They've done this in past years as well. This was also my second year to do this. And there were five of us all together. We were joined as well by Claudia Pineda, who's with the city health department. And went out, 2 hours, and I guess it's 8 to 10 p.m. on Tuesdays and then 6 to 8 a.m. on Wednesdays. The district that we covered is between Lake and Allen and between Colorado and Del Mar. And it includes the PCC campus. The church itself is located at Hill and Del Mar, right across from PCC. So we were surveying the zone, where the church is located. And we walked the streets, during both periods, covered the entire zone. We split into two teams, the way Terry described. It's probably the only way we were going to be able to cover that much ground. I would say on the whole, I haven't gone back to count specifically, but probably somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 people who were on the streets. I think probably 3 or 4 we counted in the evening, and then another 4, 5, 6 maybe in the morning. And then in addition to that, we were requested, since the Shower of Hope, comes to Knox on Wednesday mornings, to go ahead and extend the count to cover people who may have been uncounted who were coming to use those facilities. So we did that as well. So that was from about 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., which is the time period within which the Shower of Hope operates at Knox, and counted probably another 13 or 14 people who had not been counted previously. That was about 2/3 of the people. Another third had been counted. And so we were able to document that. I had a similar question to yours as to why we did this in January. It would be much more comfortable if we did it in May. It is a little cold and a little dark, but it's important. And I think it's important to the people who get counted as well. One of the experiences that I have had is that people who are homeless or unhoused, not all of them, but certainly a large number of them, want to talk. They appreciate the attention. They tend to be marginalized in society, and I think they feel that marginalization. And when someone goes out and makes the effort to encounter them and engage with them, I think that's highly appreciated. And that's the overall sense that I've received.
You and Terry and others like yourselves, you're sort of the boots on the ground, and you had an opportunity or have an opportunity to interact with these people and you know, get their actual story. I'm assuming that a lot of them do have real stories about how they came to be in the situation that they're in, and I'm wondering how that hits you emotionally, and how you try. You can't really stay detached from that, I would assume, and so I'm wondering if you can share some of the stories that you've heard from some of the folks that you talk to, and how that affects you, and I direct that question to all three of you, actually.
Hey, Joe, I like to. I came to volunteer for the homeless because I have a brother that is not homeless, but he is a part of the throughout the day. There's a group that I think I can't say Jessica. She pretty much understands that there's a group that's out there in the daytime and they hang out at the bus stops and all that, but they disappear at night. Where they go, we don't know. My brother goes back to my mother's garage, but that's how I got started. I needed some answers, but we ran into a gentleman, and this one was heartbreaking to me. That he said he moved here from New York. He was at the Pacific corner was I think it was Lake and Orange Grove, and he was out in the middle of the street panhandling. So we finally got him to come in and have a conversation. And he said it came from New York. He got on the subways here in California. He got robbed of everything that he had. Now he said he's only been here for 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks he looked pretty much like a hermit. Now this is the story he told, and he was very receptive, answered every question. He received all of our blankets and everything we had to offer him. I even gave him a test kit. He says, I would like to test. So that was to me, that felt good. And then the next morning when we went back out, he wasn't there at that corner anymore, but he had found a place down the street at next to a little Mexican restaurant. He had went back into there, so he was actually. We didn't count him the second time once we recognized who he was, but that one kind of got to me a little bit. That some people are transient that have to find a way out of the city of Los Angeles because of where all the predators hang out at. So Pasadena is kind of a safe place.
What I have found by and large is that the people who are homeless, or at least the ones that I've encountered, are primarily homeless because of financial reasons. It's because they've lost a job or they've had health issues, which were costly and, took up, their income such that they weren't able to remain housed, pay rent and so forth. Sometimes it's just because the rent became too expensive. As Jenny was mentioning earlier, we have a severe housing shortage in California. I'm a retired architect and real estate attorney, and I've been dealing with housing policy issues in the state for 30 or 40 years as part of my career, and have seen how these housing policies have contributed towards higher costs, higher housing costs, and resulting homelessness. You hear a lot about the mental health issues as well as substance abuse, but most of the people that I encounter, it's really a financial issue as opposed to an issue such as that. I do talk to people who have specific problems. There are a lot of homeless veterans who are dealing with the VA, which is, again, if you're in Pasadena, you have to travel to Westwood or you have to travel to Long Beach. That's a challenge. I encounter people who have difficulty navigating really the system, trying to get unemployment benefits, trying to get like EBT cards, the vouchers for food and so forth that are issued by the state and the county. What strikes me is that really what we need is more people who are out on the street helping to provide these services on a one-on-one basis. I know that there are people who do that. There are caseworkers who are out there. I just get the sense that we need more of that available. People who are on the street don't have the same access to, well, again, those services. A lot of people have cell phones. They have to find some place with Wi-Fi. Maybe they can go to a library. They're probably not going to be allowed to sit in a Starbucks for very long with all of their belongings. Laundry services, there's difficulty there. Health services. One of the things I'd like to see with Shower of Hope is maybe we could get a mobile medical facility to come out on a periodic basis to assist people. There are things that those of us who have access to housing and so forth tend to take for granted, which are very difficult for people on the street to be able to access, under their circumstances and conditions. And that's what I sort of hear over and over again. So my reaction is really, what more can we do to try to help? What more can we do to try to provide these services? In the interim, until we're able to produce enough housing to alleviate the crisis, which is going to take many years. As Jenny said, it's been decades in the making. I think it's going to be decades to resolve.
But what services are available to help these people to get off of the streets? And Jennifer, I think that's a question that perhaps is best directed to you to begin with as the coordinator in Pasadena. But Patrick, perhaps you'll have an answer or some insight into this as well.
Sure. First, I just wanted to take a quick moment to, I think, lift up some aspects of our count that are, I think, pretty special in Pasadena. We sort of hinted at them, but I want to make it really clear. So in Pasadena, when our volunteers go out, we ask them to engage with everyone they count and conduct a survey. A little more than half of people do actually complete the survey, but that's how we get the rich data that we collect. And it allows us to ask specific questions, about where people are from. And we find that most people are from Pasadena and how long they've been in Pasadena. And, the answer is most often decades. We also have our volunteers distribute some cold weather supplies. I think Terry mentioned that a bit, hand warmers and emergency blankets, beanies and gloves, etc. And we also distribute a resource card. The resource card will direct folks to places where they can go to get meals and showers, really resources that are meant to meet their basic human needs. And at those locations would have an opportunity to get connected to more housing and homeless services. So here in Pasadena, we have such a wealth of services, and we have a long history of being a city that provides a high level of services to people with various needs. Right now, actually, we are developing our new homelessness plan, which will lay out our priorities for what types of services. And I think that we kind of group them into different buckets. One, which we're calling essential services, is meeting those basic human needs while folks are homeless. So the showers are a really good example. Showers and laundry and medical needs and mental health needs, and food and shelter ultimately. The services that are provided to keep folks healthy and alive and safe while they're experiencing homelessness. And then we have the services that connect folks to permanent housing, and also the supportive services that will help them to retain that housing. And so that can, look a lot of different ways depending on the need of the individual or the family. And then finally, homelessness prevention is a big part of what we do. Um, Ultimately, we won't end the homelessness crisis if we can stem that inflow of people falling into homelessness. So that's the other kind of area of focus. Um, I've lost track of your question, so I don't know if I've answered your question, but those are the different types of services that provided. I think it's really critical that we develop a well-balanced system. So we can't put all of our resources into shelter because we need, permanent housing resources for folks to get into when they leave the shelter, for instance. We can't do only prevention or permanent housing. We need to make sure we're caring for those who are experiencing homelessness while they're experiencing homelessness, particularly because we've seen, even as our homeless population, our homeless count has kind of leveled off over the past few years, the length of time that people experience homelessness here in Pasadena has been growing. And so during the pandemic, that was really, I think, when we started to refocus on providing these basic services. Initially it was out of fear, and wanting to make sure that the COVID wasn't spreading among the homeless population. We were doing showers and hand washing stations, and but it's something that we're really working to maintain, even as the pandemic, becomes more of kind of a memory, because we see the benefit, right? And if the impacts are so wide ranging, people are healthier when they're able to be clean and clothed and fed, but there's also, that puts them in a better position to then take steps toward getting back into permanent housing. We find that that's a really important foundation for folks, just to be able to take care of their bodies, to take that and then be able to move forward with, other plans for stabilizing their lives.
Are there job training or employment programs that are available to, as Patrick and Terry both indicated, a lot of the people that they encountered, the homeless persons that they encountered during their time counting, are on the streets because of financial difficulties. So are there employment or job training programs that are available to help people return to, I don't want to say being productive members of society, because that doesn't sound good, but in essence, to help them get back on their feet?
Here in Pasadena, I think there are a few primary resources that are particularly focused on the homeless population. One is Union Station actually has an employment program that's been operating for many years called Sources, and it's available to anybody with a history of homelessness. And even when their participants, obtain permanent housing, they are able to continue using those employment resources indefinitely. Our Foothill Workforce Development Board, which is on Green Street, and it's a public employment agency, they have programming and resources specifically for people who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. So there are, additional resources available there. And then I also wanted to highlight the work of the Flint Reach Center, which focuses on our reentry population, so people who are exiting the criminal justice system. Not exclusively people who are experiencing homelessness, but certainly there's a large overlap in those populations. And they have apprenticeship programs, job fairs, different job training programs. So there are resources, and the goal of our homeless services is to not just get folks housed, but also get them to a point where they can be self-sufficient, if that's something that's attainable for them, and have more fulfilling lives. Really, it's not just getting the roof over your head, but I think, you mentioned being a productive member of society. I think one way to look at it is to have kind of meaningful activities. And for many people, that's work or school or volunteer work. We actually see that quite a bit, where individuals who've experienced homelessness, they get housed and want to give back and want to turn right back around and volunteer at the shelter or the soup kitchen and help others who are walking that path that they walked.
One question that comes to mind, and perhaps you, Jennifer, are best equipped to answer the question because it really involves statistical analysis. When we look at the escalating numbers of homeless, are we seeing a massive number of people becoming homeless? A massive increase in the number of people becoming homeless each year, or is it a situation where it's only a few people that slip into homelessness in any given year, but because no one who reaches the level of homelessness ever gets out of there, is that why we're seeing the increase? In other words, are people being able to return, get back on their feet, get out of being homeless? Or is the number just continuing to swell because once you're homeless, you never stop being homeless?
We're definitely seeing, I would say, both. There's absolutely an inflow issue here, particularly in our region, but our sector, homeless services, is housing folks at really unprecedented numbers. Across the county, we're seeing tens of thousands of people exiting homelessness, getting back into their own home every year. And yet countywide, of course, the numbers have continued to grow, with the exception of last year, where we started to see that leveling off. And that's because of the inflow. More people are falling into homelessness than are exiting homelessness. We do also, of course, have a subset of our homeless population that have a lot of barriers and are experiencing homelessness for long periods of time. But that's really isn't what is behind any growth in numbers. During the pandemic, so we really only have 2020 to look at, or excuse me, 2022 to look at for this information, because we didn't do a count in 2021. But we found in 2022 here in Pasadena that we saw a reduction in people who were experiencing homelessness for the first time. In 2020, which we conducted the 2020 count really right before the pandemic hit us in a huge way. And then, so in 2020, 19% of folks that we interviewed were homeless for the first time. And then in 2022, that dropped down to 9%. Again, we think that is likely a reflection of the strong tenant protections that were put into place, particularly in the early pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see this year and next year kind of what that number looks like. But it's absolutely something that we track. Who is falling into homelessness? Who's newly homeless this year? And what are the reasons that they fall into homelessness? And what can we do to get out ahead of that, to prevent that from happening more?
Terry and Patrick, I'd like to ask you this question. During the time that you were out counting, did you ever, at any point during the count, feel that you were in an unsafe environment? Was it ever a situation where you felt threatened by any of the homeless that you encountered, or were they always kind and gentle and very receptive to your work?
I think our training that we had, our orientation, kind of gave us a really big look at, okay, what to do, how to do it, and where to do it. That was really valuable to us. The places we went into were either very lit. We stayed out of places that would cause us to be afraid of it. And I think our group that we had were pretty brave people, I must say. And we pretty much stayed together, and we stayed in lit places. Didn't try to encounter anyone that didn't want to participate in the. We had a couple of those that, stay out of my way, leave me alone type attitude. And all we could do there is just do the. the observation on it, but didn't run into any kind of situation to that sort.
And that was my experience as well. We did not encounter anyone who was hostile or threatening at all. I felt very safe the entire time that we were out. We did encounter people that didn't want to be surveyed, simply said no, for one reason or another, but no one who was at all hostile or threatening or really even disagreeable, in my experience.
And Terry, you brought up an interesting point just now, and something that I think bears exploring. You mentioned that you have training before you are sent out into the field, so it isn't simply a case of you walk in and say, "I'd like to volunteer," and they hand you a pen and a clipboard and say, "Go out and count people." There is training involved before you are deployed into the field. Is that correct?
Yeah, part of the criteria was we had to do an orientation, and I think there was 4 different categories we had, if I remember correctly, from why the whole town is starting down to the safety. So uh, it's always good to have that kind of information. So, uh, they've done it so many times. They know where the bad things are. So you stay out of parks. They have professionals that handle the park. You stay off of pretty much where I think that's what the city owns, uh, and they tend to go to those places. So they had professionals that handle those that kept us out of harm's way of a lot of stuff that happened.
And in talking to the people experiencing homelessness, I wonder if you were able to glean from them what sense of security they have living on the street. Do most of the homeless feel comfortable where they are? So often we hear that they don't want to leave, and I myself have often wondered if, in fact, that's accurate. So again, I pose the question to all three of you. What's your sense of the number of people that feel safe on the street, and people who would like to be off of the street?
That's a loaded question, Joe. Uh, uh, it's loaded, but it's funny. I used to be a truck driver, and years ago, I heard about Skid Row, and back in the '80s, I went to Skid Row and to see what was really going on. They didn't have the encampment that you see today. I go every Thursday down to the food bank, and when I go into downtown, and the encampments are everywhere. As far as the question, some people are comfortable being out there. Well, I've heard the term is tent mentality. Uh, they don't want to follow the rules. I've asked, I've walked the street. I live in the community I actually had a chance to survey. I live on Egg Avenue, and they want to be there. Most of them, some uh, just don't want to be a part of the system. My brother fell out of the system, has retirement, he has everything, but he chooses not to do anything. So I don't know where Jennifer would find that guy, but he has a place to go at night when the sun goes down.
It's different people have different reactions. I would say the majority of the people that I encounter, and I, volunteer, with the church and coordinate with the Shower of Hope. And so I do have opportunities to speak with the people who show up there from time to time. Most of them want to be off the street. And as far as feeling safe, again, it varies. Some people are relatively comfortable, to the extent that you can be comfortable living on the street. Others, they have encountered, difficult situations, and yeah, they don't like it. They're scared. So it just depends on the individual, I think.
I thought you had something to add to this as well.
I've been doing this work for a long time, and before I was in my current position, I did direct services, and I worked with folks who are on the street. And I can say that I've never met anybody who doesn't want their own home, right, and doesn't want to live inside. I think that when we encounter, resistance to that, or just folks who don't want to engage, I think Terry said it, engage with the system. That is often reflective of a trust issue. And I think that makes so much sense. I mean, this is a population that is disenfranchised, that's been let down by society over and over again. Many of them have had, negative and disappointing experiences, even with our homeless services sector. And so, a one-off interaction like somebody might have on the homeless count, or even just, in their everyday lives, can look like that, where somebody says, I don't want your help, I don't want to be involved. But we find that, over time, when there's continued engagement with a street outreach worker, for instance, and trust can be built, that, deep down, folks really do want a home. But like everybody else, people want a home without a lot of rules and strings attached, right? My home,
There you go.
doesn't. But I think that's fair. I mean, I think that the only rules and strings attached that my home comes with are the terms of my lease. And in the past, decades ago, and maybe even not so long ago, a lot of our homeless and housing programs had a lot of those strings attached. Like you had to become sober first before you got your place, and you had to get employed first, and you had to go through all these hoops first before you got your housing. And about 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit longer, our whole sector has really switched to this newer philosophy of housing first, where we really recognize that housing is the basic human right, and that the chances of folks even being able to get sober, get mental health services, become healthy, get a job, achieve those goals, whatever their goals are so greatly increased when they have a safe place to sleep. You asked about how safe people feel. And I think it's really important to recognize that people experiencing homelessness are victims of violent crimes at much higher rates than the general population. It really isn't safe out there. There's a whole other level of danger there for women in particular. But even here in Pasadena, we've had in the past year, there have been several people who were homeless who have been murdered on our streets. And so it's not safe to live outside. People really do need the security of their home. And that's not even, mentioning just the dangers of the elements, cold and heat, et cetera. So, again, housing's a human right. And I think that the kind of system and the services that we've built now really recognize that. And, our outreach teams are really committed to engaging with folks, for as long as it takes, to get folks, connected to the home that they deserve.
And with that, I'm afraid we have run out of time for this program. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Jennifer O'Reilly Jones with the city of Pasadena, as well as Mr. Patrick Perry and Terry Bourne. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. For our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed on this program, you can email them to arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org, and we may include them in a future broadcast. Until next time, this has been Arroyo Live. I'm Joe Carbonetta. Thank you for watching, and good night.